The cabin shook with the force of the storm outside, but nothing compared to the trembling in Benjamin Rodriguez's massive hands as he stared at the woman before him. Catherine Stewart stood in his doorway, soaked to the bone, her traveling dress torn and muddy, her dark hair plastered against her pale face. Lightning illuminated the raw terror in her eyes, but also something else, something that made his breath catch in his throat. "I haven't touched a woman since 1760, he whispered, his voice rough as mountain granite, the words torn from somewhere deep in his chest. His hands shook as he reached for her, decades of isolation and loneliness crashing over him like an avalanche. "God help me, I haven't." The confession hung between them in the smoky air of the cabin, heavy with the weight of 40 years of solitude. Catherine's lips parted, her breath coming in short gasps, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she stepped closer, her small hand reaching up to touch his bearded face. "Then touch me now," she breathed, and Benjamin's control shattered like ice in spring. He pulled her into his arms, into his bed, into his life forever. But the story of how they reached this moment began 3 days earlier, when the first snows of winter started falling on the Colorado Territory. Catherine Stewart had never imagined her life would lead her to this God-forsaken wilderness, bouncing in the back of a supply wagon through mountain passes that seemed to scrape the very belly of heaven. The year was 1803 and she was 26 years old. Considered a spinster by the standards of Philadelphia society, though she'd never felt the sting of that label more keenly than now. Her fingers clutched the letter that had changed everything, the paper worn soft from countless readings. The letter had arrived on a Tuesday morning in September, delivered by a travel-worn courier who'd ridden hard from the Western Territories. Catherine's younger sister Margaret had written it in her careful script, but the desperation bled through every word. Margaret's husband had died of fever, leaving her alone with two small children in a mining camp called Silver Creek, high in the Colorado mountains. The winter was coming early and hard, and Margaret was begging Catherine to come to help her survive until spring. "You're the only family I have left," Margaret had written. "Please, Catherine, I know it's asking everything of you, but I have nowhere else to turn." Catherine had sold everything she owned in Philadelphia, her small inheritance from their parents, her few pieces of jewelry, even her mother's china. The money had been just enough to hire passage with a supply train heading west, though the wagon master had warned her repeatedly about the dangers. "It ain't no place for a lady," he'd said, spitting tobacco juice into the dust, "especially not this late in the season. Winter comes fast and hard in them mountains." But Catherine had been determined. Margaret was all the family she had left in the world, and she wouldn't abandon her sister to face the wilderness alone. Now, 3 weeks into the journey, she was beginning to understand the wagon master's warnings. The supply train had been attacked by bandits 2 days ago, just as they had entered the high country. Catherine still shuddered when she remembered the sound of gunfire echoing off the canyon walls, the screams of the horses, the shouts of desperate men. She'd hidden under a canvas tarp in the supply wagon, praying to a God she wasn't sure was listening anymore. When the shooting stopped, 5 men were dead, including the wagon master. The survivors had taken what they could carry and scattered, leaving Catherine alone with a wounded mule and a wagon full of supplies she couldn't possibly move by herself. The bandits had missed her hiding place, but they'd taken the horses and most of the food. That first night alone in the wilderness had been the longest of Catherine's life. She'd huddled in the wagon, listening to the howl of wolves in the distance, the crack of settling timber, the whisper of wind through the pines. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat. Every sound promised danger. By morning, she'd made a decision. She would take what she could carry and continue on foot. Silver Creek was still 2 days away according to the map, but she had no choice. Winter was coming, and staying with the wagon meant certain death. She'd fashioned a pack from canvas and rope, filling it with the most essential supplies: a few cans of food, a blanket, matches, the small pistol her father had given her years ago, though she'd never fired it. The pack was heavy, but she was stronger than she looked, strengthened by years of managing her own household in Philadelphia. The first day of walking had been manageable. The trail was clear, winding through stands of aspen and pine, following the course of a rushing stream. Catherine had even found a strange peace in the solitude, in the vast silence of the mountains broken only by the sound of her own footsteps and the distant call of birds. But on the second day, the weather turned. The storm came down from the peaks like the wrath of God himself, turning the world white and wild in a matter of minutes. Catherine had never experienced anything like it. The wind driving snow so thick she couldn't see 3 feet in any direction. The temperature plummeted, and her thin traveling dress, suitable for Philadelphia's mild autumn, was utterly inadequate against the mountain winter. She stumbled through the whiteout, her pack growing heavier with each step, ice forming on her eyelashes and in her hair. The trail disappeared beneath the snow, and soon she was walking blind, hoping she was still heading in the right direction, praying she wouldn't walk off a cliff or into a ravine. Hours passed, or maybe it was minutes. Time seemed to stretch and compress in the howling white void. Catherine's feet went numb first, then her hands, even inside her gloves. She began to stumble more frequently, her legs refusing to obey her commands. The pack slipped from her shoulders and she left it behind, focusing only on putting one foot in front of the other. When she finally saw the light through the trees, she thought she was hallucinating. A warm, golden glow filtering through the storm, impossible and beautiful. But as she drew closer, the light resolved into the windows of a cabin, smoke rising from its chimney like a promise of salvation. Catherine had just enough strength left to reach the door before her legs gave out entirely. She collapsed on the wooden porch, her fist barely making a sound as she tried to knock. The door was solid timber, thick enough to keep out bears and worse things. And her frozen hands had no strength left. She was dying. The thought came to her with surprising clarity as she lay there in the snow, the cold seeping through her bones. She would die here on this stranger's porch, and Margaret would never know what had happened to her. Her sister would wait and wait, watching the trail for a rescue that would never come. The door opened so suddenly that Catherine nearly fell inside. A massive figure filled the doorway, backlit by the warm glow of the cabin's interior. She looked up and saw the most intimidating man she'd ever encountered. Tall as a tree and broad as a mountain, with wild dark hair and a beard that hadn't seen a razor in decades. His clothes were rough, homespun and leather, and his hands, as he reached down for her, were scarred and calloused from years of hard living. But his eyes, when she met them, were gentle. "Jesus Christ," he breathed, his voice rough with disuse. "Lady, what are you doing out in this?" He lifted her as easily as if she weighed nothing, carrying her into the warmth of the cabin. Catherine tried to speak, to explain, but her teeth were chattering too violently to form words. The man, this mountain giant, set her down gently near the fireplace and began working with swift efficiency to save her life. He stripped off her wet clothes without ceremony, his touch clinical and careful, wrapping her in thick wool blankets. He rubbed her hands and feet, bringing painful feeling back to her frozen extremities. He heated water and made her drink it in small sips, warming her from the inside out. Through it all, he barely spoke, just muttered occasionally under his breath, words she couldn't quite catch. But his touch was gentle, almost reverent, as if he couldn't quite believe she was real. As the feeling returned to her body and her mind cleared, Catherine began to take in her surroundings. The cabin was larger than it had appeared from outside, with a main room dominated by a massive stone fireplace. The walls were lined with shelves holding books, more books than she would have expected to find in such a remote place. Furs covered the floor, and handmade furniture filled the space, all of it crafted with obvious skill and care. But what struck her most was the absolute orderliness of everything. Every tool had its place. Every book was precisely aligned. Every surface was clean. This was not the chaotic den of a wild mountain man, but the careful home of someone who had made peace with solitude. "What's your name?" the man finally asked when Catherine had stopped shivering enough to speak. He sat across from her, maintaining a careful distance, his hands folded in his lap as if he didn't trust himself to move too close. "Catherine Stewart," she managed, her voice still hoarse. "I was traveling to Silver Creek, to my sister. The supply train was attacked, and I was walking, and then the storm." He nodded slowly, his dark eyes never leaving her face. "Silver Creek's still a day's walk from here, even in good weather. You wouldn't have made it in this storm." Are you going to tell me your name? Catherine asked when he fell silent again. For a long moment, he didn't answer. Then so quietly she almost didn't hear him, he said, Benjamin Rodriguez. Though it's been so long since anyone called me by name, I sometimes forget it myself. How long have you lived here alone? Another long pause. 43 years, he said finally. Came up here in 1760 after the war. Haven't been down to civilization since. Catherine stared at him, trying to process what he'd said. 43 years of complete solitude, alone in these mountains. No wonder he seemed more like a force of nature than a man. Why? She asked softly. Benjamin's jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. When he spoke, his voice was heavy with old pain. I was a different man then. Young, angry, full of violence. The war made monsters of us all, but I was worse than most. I did things. He stopped, his hands clenching into fists. I came up here to get away from what I'd become, to make sure I never hurt anyone again. The confession hung between them in the warm air of the cabin. Catherine studied his face, seeing past the wild hair and untamed beard to the man beneath. There was pain there, old and deep, but also a fundamental gentleness that spoke to her heart. And have you, she asked, hurt anyone, I mean? No, he said simply. Haven't seen another human being in all that time. You're the first. The weight of that statement settled over Catherine like a blanket. She was the first person this man had seen in over 4 decades, the first human voice he'd heard besides his own, the first face that wasn't his own reflection in the stream. That must have been very lonely, she said quietly. Benjamin's laugh was harsh, bitter. Lonely was the point. Lonely was safer. Outside, the storm continued to rage, the wind howling around the cabin like a living thing. Catherine pulled the blankets tighter around herself and looked around the room again, seeing it now with new eyes. Every carefully placed object, every precisely organized shelf, spoke of a man fighting to maintain his humanity in complete isolation. The books, she said, nodding toward the shelves. You read them all? Many times over. They're the only company I've had. He gestured toward a shelf near the fireplace. Shakespeare, Milton, the Bible. Some philosophy, some history. I trade furs down in the valley once a year for supplies, and I always ask for books. Once a year? But you said you haven't seen anyone. I leave the furs at a trading post and take what I need. Never see a soul. Been doing it that way for decades. Catherine began to understand the careful structure of his solitude, the elaborate measures he'd taken to remain completely apart from human contact. It spoke of a discipline that was almost monastic, a commitment to isolation that must have cost him everything. What did you do before? She asked. Before you came here? Benjamin was quiet for so long that Catherine thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. I was a soldier, fought in the French and Indian War, then stayed on as a scout for the British. I was good at killing, too good, and after a while, I started to like it. The admission seemed to cost him something, and Catherine saw his shoulders tense as if expecting her to recoil in horror. Instead, she leaned forward slightly, her voice gentle. What changed? There was a village, Benjamin said, his eyes fixed on the fire. French settlers, mostly families. My commanding officer said they were harboring enemy scouts, but I knew it wasn't true. They were just people trying to survive, same as anyone. But orders were orders, and I followed them. He stopped, his jaw working silently for a moment. Catherine waited, sensing that this was a story he'd never told anyone, a burden he'd carried alone for 4 decades. When it was over, he continued, when the smoke cleared and the screaming stopped, I saw what we'd done, what I'd done. There was a woman there about your age with a little girl. They were hiding in a root cellar, and I found them. Catherine's breath caught, but she didn't speak. I could have let them go, Benjamin said, his voice breaking slightly. Should have let them go. But I was following orders, and I was too much of a coward to disobey. Too afraid of what my fellow soldiers would think if I showed mercy. The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of old sins. Catherine found herself thinking of her sister Margaret, alone with her children in Silver Creek, and her heart ached for this tormented man. "So you came here," she said finally. "Deserted that very night. Rode as far west as I could, then started climbing. Found this valley and decided it was far enough from civilization that I couldn't hurt anyone else. And you've been here ever since, punishing yourself?" Benjamin's head snapped up, his eyes meeting hers for the first time since he'd started his story. "It's not punishment," he said harshly. "It's necessity. You don't understand what I'm capable of." "I understand that you saved my life tonight," Catherine said quietly. "I understand that you've lived alone for 43 years rather than risk hurting someone. I understand that you've built a life here that's careful and disciplined and good. You don't know me." "No," Catherine agreed. "But I know kindness when I see it. And I know that a truly evil man wouldn't have spent 4 decades in exile for his crimes." Benjamin stood abruptly, moving to the window to stare out at the storm. His massive frame was silhouetted against the glass, and Catherine could see the tension in every line of his body. "The storm's getting worse," he said, clearly trying to change the subject. "You'll be here for days, maybe longer." Catherine felt a flutter of something that might have been fear, or might have been something else entirely. "Is that a problem?" "I don't know," Benjamin said honestly, turning back to face her. "I've never had to find out." The honesty in his voice touched something deep in Catherine's chest. Here was a man who had been alone so long that the simple presence of another human being was uncharted territory. She thought of her own life in Philadelphia, surrounded by people but often feeling just as isolated in her own way. "I won't be any trouble," she said. "I can cook and clean, earn my keep until the weather clears." "That's not what I'm worried about," Benjamin said, his voice so quiet she had to strain to hear it. The next morning dawned clear and blindingly bright, the storm having blown itself out sometime before sunrise. Catherine woke to find herself alone in the cabin, wrapped in warm blankets on a makeshift bed near the fireplace. Through the windows, she could see that the world had been transformed overnight into a pristine wilderness of white, beautiful and deadly in equal measure. Benjamin had left her a plate of food, simple fare but well prepared, along with a note written in surprisingly elegant handwriting. "Gone to check traps, back by evening. Stay warm." It was signed simply, B. Catherine spent the day exploring the cabin more thoroughly, marveling at the life Benjamin had built for himself in this remote valley. Everything spoke of careful craftsmanship and patient skill. The furniture was handmade but beautifully proportioned. The tools were well maintained and precisely arranged, and the books were organized with the care of a scholar. She found his journal on a shelf near his bed, a thick leather-bound volume filled with his thoughts and observations. She didn't read it. That would have been an unforgivable intrusion. But she noticed that the entries were dated and regular, suggesting a man who had maintained his sanity through discipline and routine. In the afternoon, she began preparing dinner from the supplies she found in his well-stocked pantry. It felt strange to be cooking for someone else after so many years of living alone herself, but also oddly comforting. She made a simple stew from dried meat and vegetables, seasoning it with herbs she found hanging from the rafters. Benjamin returned as the sun was setting, stamping snow from his boots on the porch before entering. He stopped short when he saw the table set for two, the smell of cooking food filling the cabin. "You didn't have to," he said, but Catherine could hear something in his voice that might have been gratitude. "I wanted to," she replied, ladling stew into wooden bowls. "It's been a long time since I cooked for anyone but myself." They ate in comfortable silence, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the quiet scrape of spoons against wood. Catherine found herself stealing glances at Benjamin, studying his face in the firelight. Without the wild desperation of the previous night, she could see that he was younger than she'd first thought, probably in his early 60s, with intelligent dark eyes and strong features beneath the untamed beard. "The stew is excellent," he said finally, breaking the silence. "Thank you. My mother taught me to cook. She said a woman should be able to feed herself and anyone else who might need feeding." "Wise woman." "She was. She and my father both died of cholera 5 years ago. That's when Margaret and I were left on our own." Benjamin nodded, understanding the weight of loss. "Family's important," he said quietly. Yes, it is. That's why I have to get to Silver Creek. Margaret is all I have left. Benjamin was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. The trail won't be passable for weeks, he said finally. Maybe not until spring, depending on how hard the winter comes. Catherine's heart sank. She'd known it was a possibility, but hearing it stated so baldly made it real. She'll think I'm dead, she whispered. Maybe. Or maybe she'll know you're smart enough to find shelter and wait out the weather. Catherine looked at him sharply, hearing something in his tone. You think I should stay here? All winter? Benjamin's jaw tightened. I think you don't have much choice. The alternative is freezing to death in a snowbank somewhere between here and Silver Creek. The truth of it settled over Catherine like a weight. She was trapped here, in this remote cabin, with a man she barely knew. A man who had lived in complete isolation for 4 decades, who claimed to be capable of terrible violence. But as she looked at Benjamin across the table, she felt no fear. Instead, she felt something she couldn't quite name, a recognition that went deeper than rational thought. The days that followed fell into a gentle rhythm that surprised them both. Catherine proved to be an excellent cook and housekeeper, bringing a warmth to the cabin that Benjamin hadn't realized was missing. She mended his clothes with careful stitches, organized his books with a scholar's eye, and filled the silence with stories of her life in Philadelphia. Benjamin, for his part, began to remember how to be human. He spoke more each day, sharing stories of his life in the mountains, teaching Catherine about the plants and animals that shared their valley. He showed her how to read the weather in the color of the sky, how to tell the age of a tree by its bark, how to find her way by the stars. But beneath the comfortable domesticity, there was a tension neither of them acknowledged. Catherine was acutely aware of Benjamin as a man, of his strength and gentleness, of the way his eyes followed her movements around the cabin. And Benjamin was fighting a battle with himself, torn between the human connection he craved and the fear of what he might be capable of. It came to a head on their 10th day together, when Catherine was washing clothes in the stream that ran near the cabin. The water was ice cold, fed by mountain snow, and her hands were red and numb by the time she finished. She was walking back to the cabin, her arms full of wet laundry, when she slipped on a patch of ice. Benjamin caught her before she hit the ground, his strong arms wrapping around her waist, pulling her against his chest. For a moment they stood frozen, her face inches from his, her hands pressed against the solid warmth of his chest. Catherine, he breathed, her name a prayer on his lips. She could feel the tension in his body, the careful control he maintained over himself. His hands were shaking where they rested on her waist, and she realized with sudden clarity that he was afraid. Not of her, but of himself, of what he might do. Benjamin, she whispered, her hand coming up to touch his bearded cheek. It's all right, but it wasn't all right, not for him. He released her so quickly she almost fell again, stepping back as if she'd burned him. I'm sorry, he said, his voice rough. I shouldn't have. You caught me when I fell, Catherine said gently. There's nothing to apologize for. But Benjamin was already retreating, both physically and emotionally. He spent the rest of the day outside, checking and rechecking his traps, chopping wood that didn't need chopping, anything to avoid being alone with her in the close confines of the cabin. That night, Catherine lay awake listening to him move restlessly around the main room, and she began to understand the true nature of his torment. It wasn't just guilt over his past crimes that kept him isolated. It was fear of his own capacity for human connection, terror that if he allowed himself to care for someone, he might somehow hurt them. The next morning, she found him sitting by the fire, staring into the flames with haunted eyes. Tell me about her, Catherine said quietly, settling into the chair across from him. Who? The woman you loved before. The one who made you understand what you'd lost when you came up here. Benjamin's head snapped up, his eyes meeting hers with surprise. How did you? A man doesn't live alone for 43 years just from guilt, Catherine said. There was someone, wasn't there? Someone you left behind. Benjamin was quiet for so long that Catherine thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Her name was Maria, he said. I met her in a little town outside of Albany after I deserted. She was a widow, ran a boarding house. I stayed there for a few weeks, trying to figure out what to do with myself. He paused, his hands clenching and unclenching in his lap. She was kind to me, even though she could see I was running from something. Never asked questions, just fed me and gave me a safe place to sleep. And slowly I started to think maybe I could build a different life. Maybe I could be the kind of man who deserves someone like her. What happened? I told her the truth, Benjamin said simply, about what I'd done in the war, about the people I'd killed. I thought she had a right to know what kind of man she was caring for. Catherine's heart ached for him. She could already guess how the story ended. She was horrified, Benjamin continued, not just by what I'd done, but by the fact that I'd been living in her house, sleeping under her roof, sitting at her table. She said I was a monster, that I'd deceived her, that she never wanted to see me again. So you came here. I rode west that very night, found this valley and decided it was far enough from anyone I could hurt. I've been here ever since. Catherine absorbed this, understanding now the full weight of Benjamin's self-imposed exile. He hadn't just been running from his crimes, he'd been running from the possibility of human connection, terrified that anyone who truly knew him would reject him as Maria had. She was wrong, Catherine said quietly. Benjamin's laugh was bitter. Was she? I'm a killer, Catherine. I've taken lives, destroyed families. What kind of woman would want a man like that? The kind of woman who can see past your worst moments to the man you've become, Catherine replied. The kind of woman who understands that we're all capable of terrible things, but that doesn't mean we're defined by them forever. You don't understand. I understand perfectly, Catherine interrupted, her voice gaining strength. I understand that you've spent 43 years punishing yourself for things you can't change. I understand that you've built a good life here, a careful life, a life that proves you're not the man you were in 1760. Benjamin stared at her, something shifting in his dark eyes. I understand that you saved my life, Catherine continued, and that you've treated me with nothing but kindness and respect. I understand that you're afraid to trust yourself, afraid to believe that you might deserve happiness. Catherine, and I understand that I'm falling in love with you, she said, the words coming out in a rush before she could stop them. The silence that followed was deafening. Benjamin went completely still, his face a mask of shock and something that might have been hope. You can't, he said finally, his voice hoarse. You don't know what you're saying. I know exactly what I'm saying, Catherine replied, standing up and moving to kneel beside his chair. I know that you're the gentlest man I've ever met, despite everything you've been through. I know that you've spent 4 decades learning to be better than you were. I know that when you touch me, I feel safer than I've ever felt in my life. Benjamin's hands were shaking as he reached out to cup her face, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone. I haven't touched a woman since 1760, he whispered, the words torn from somewhere deep in his chest. God help me, I haven't. The confession hung between them in the warm air of the cabin, heavy with the weight of 43 years of solitude. Catherine's heart broke for this man who had denied himself the most basic human connection for so long, who had lived like a monk in his mountain exile. Then touch me now, she breathed, her hand covering his where it rested against her cheek. Benjamin's control shattered like ice in spring. He pulled her up from the floor into his arms, his mouth finding hers with a desperation that spoke of decades of loneliness. Catherine melted against him, her arms wrapping around his neck, her fingers tangling in his long hair. The kiss was everything she had imagined and more. Tender and fierce and full of a hunger that neither of them had acknowledged until this moment. Benjamin's hands roamed over her back, reacquainting themselves with the feel of another human being, the warmth and softness that he had denied himself for so long. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Benjamin rested his forehead against hers. Are you certain? He asked, his voice rough with emotion. Once we cross this line, there's no going back. I won't be able to let you go. Catherine smiled, her heart full of a joy she hadn't felt in years. I don't want you to let me go, she said. I want to stay here with you, Benjamin, not just until spring, but forever. Your sister will understand. She'll want me to be happy, and I've never been happier than I am right here, right now with you. Benjamin searched her face, looking for any sign of doubt or fear. Finding none, he lifted her in his arms, carrying her toward his bed with a reverence that made her feel like something precious and sacred. What followed was a claiming that was both gentle and fierce, a coming together of two souls who had been alone too long. Benjamin worshipped her body with his hands and mouth, relearning the geography of feminine curves and hollows, while Catherine gave herself to him completely, holding nothing back. They made love with the desperation of people who had found salvation in each other's arms, their bodies moving together in a rhythm as old as time itself. And when it was over, they lay entwined in the firelight, their hearts beating in synchrony, their breathing slowly returning to normal. "I love you," Benjamin whispered against her hair, the words he had never thought he would say again. "I love you too," Catherine replied, her fingers tracing patterns on his chest. "And I'm not going anywhere." Outside, the wind began to pick up again, promising another storm. But inside the cabin, wrapped in each other's arms, Catherine and Benjamin had found their own perfect shelter from the world. The winter that followed was the happiest of Benjamin's life, and perhaps of Catherine's as well. They settled into a routine that felt as natural as breathing, sharing the work of survival and the quiet pleasures of companionship. Catherine proved herself to be remarkably adaptable to mountain life, learning to read the weather signs, to preserve food for the long winter months, to move quietly through the forest. Benjamin, for his part, began to emerge from the shell of isolation he had built around himself. He laughed more, talked more, allowed himself to simply enjoy the presence of another human being. The careful discipline he had maintained for 4 decades began to soften, replaced by something warmer and more generous. They spent long evenings by the fire, reading aloud to each other from Benjamin's collection of books, or simply talking about their lives, their dreams, their fears. Catherine told him about her childhood in Philadelphia, about the sister she still worried about the loneliness she had felt even when surrounded by people. Benjamin shared stories of his early life, before the war changed him, and slowly began to believe that he might be capable of redemption after all. When spring finally came, melting the snow and opening the mountain passes, they faced a decision that neither wanted to make. Catherine could leave now, could continue on to Silver Creek to find her sister. Or she could stay, could make her life here in this remote valley with the man she loved. "I have to at least go to her," Catherine said one morning as they stood outside the cabin, watching the sun rise over the peaks. "I have to let her know I'm alive, that I'm safe. She's probably been mourning me all winter." Benjamin nodded, though she could see the fear in his eyes. "I understand. But Catherine, if you go, I'm coming back," she said firmly, taking his hands in hers. "This is my home now. You are my home. But I can't abandon Margaret without at least explaining. What if she needs you to stay? What if she can't survive without your help?" Catherine had thought about this through the long winter nights, and she had her answer ready. "Then we'll bring her here. There's room in the valley for another cabin, and you could use the help with the farming and hunting. We could build a real community here, Benjamin, a place where people who don't fit anywhere else can find peace." The idea took root in Benjamin's mind like a seed in fertile soil, a community of outcasts and misfits, people running from their past or simply seeking a simpler way of life. It was a beautiful dream, and for the first time in 43 years, he allowed himself to hope for something more than mere survival. They made the journey to Silver Creek together, Benjamin reluctant to let Catherine out of his sight even for a few days. What they found there broke Catherine's heart, but also filled her with determination. Margaret had indeed mourned her sister through the winter, but she had also grown stronger, more self-reliant. The mining camp had become a real community, with families putting down roots and building permanent homes. Margaret wept when she saw Catherine alive and well, and she listened with growing amazement as Catherine told the story of her rescue and the love she had found in the mountains. When Catherine explained her decision to return to Benjamin, Margaret surprised her by supporting it completely. "You found something rare," Margaret said, studying Benjamin with shrewd eyes. "Don't let anyone tell you to give it up for the sake of propriety or duty. Life is too short and love is too precious." They returned to the valley as the summer was reaching its peak, the meadows filled with wildflowers and the streams running clear and cold from the mountain snow. Catherine had never been so happy to see any place as she was to see the cabin nestled among the pines, smoke rising from its chimney in a welcoming spiral. That night, as they lay in bed listening to the sounds of the forest around them, Benjamin pulled Catherine close and spoke the words that had been building in his heart all winter. "Marry me," he said simply. "I know there's no preacher for 100 miles and no law up here but what we make ourselves. But I want you to be my wife in every way that matters." Catherine turned in his arms, her face glowing in the moonlight that streamed through the window. "Yes," she said without hesitation. "Yes, I'll marry you." They spoke their vows the next morning, standing in the meadow where Catherine had first seen the light of Benjamin's cabin through the storm. There were no witnesses except the mountains themselves, no rings except the ones Benjamin carved from mountain ash, no music except the song of the wind through the pines. But Catherine had never felt more married, more claimed, more completely loved. As the years passed, their dream of a community began to take shape. Other people found their way to the valley, drawn by stories of the mountain man and his wife who welcomed anyone seeking refuge from the world below. There was Robert Sanchez, a former soldier like Benjamin, who had seen too much war, and Joan Cook, a widow fleeing an abusive son-in-law. There was Donald Nelson, a freed slave seeking true freedom in the wilderness, and Virginia Jackson, a woman who had scandalized Boston society by refusing to marry the man her father chose for her. Each new arrival brought their own skills and stories, their own reasons for seeking sanctuary in the high country. Benjamin, once terrified of human contact, became the unofficial leader of their growing community, his wisdom and experience guiding them through the challenges of mountain life. Catherine became the heart of their little settlement, the one who welcomed newcomers, who settled disputes, who organized the celebrations and mourned the losses. She never regretted her choice to stay in the mountains, never looked back with longing at the civilized world she had left behind. On quiet evenings when the work was done and the community had settled in for the night, Catherine and Benjamin would sit on their porch and watch the stars emerge over the peaks. Sometimes they would talk about the past, about the unlikely chain of events that had brought them together. More often, they would simply sit in comfortable silence, their hands intertwined, their hearts full of gratitude for the love they had found in the wilderness. "Do you ever regret it?" Catherine asked one night, her head resting on Benjamin's shoulder. "Coming up here all those years ago?" Benjamin considered the question seriously, as he considered all of Catherine's questions. "I regret the things I did before I came here," he said finally. "I regret the man I was, the lives I took, the pain I caused. But I don't regret the exile itself because it led me to you. It taught me to be better than I was, and it brought me to this moment." Catherine smiled, pressing a kiss to his throat. "I love you, Benjamin Rodriguez," she said. "I love the man you were, the man you became, and the man you're still becoming." "And I love you, Catherine Rodriguez," he replied, using the name she had taken as his wife. "You saved me from a living death, brought me back to the world of the living. You are my redemption, my second chance, my forever." Above them, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, bearing witness to a love that had been forged in hardship and tempered by time. In the valley below, their community slept peacefully, secure in the knowledge that they had found a place where broken people could heal, where outcasts could belong, where love could flourish even in the most unlikely circumstances. And in their cabin, the mountain man who hadn't touched a woman since 1760 held his wife close, marveling still at the miracle of her presence in his life, at the way she had transformed his exile into a homecoming, his punishment into a blessing, his solitude into the deepest love he had ever known.